Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Nick Halaris Show. Our guest this week is Melissa Walker, the head of Giving Circles at the States Project and a very successful author of young adult books. Melissa, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Nick. So happy to be here.
Yeah, I've been excited to have this conversation. Even though the election is over, the battle for the soul of America is not. And I wanted to get this in before November, but I think the timing is perfect just because it's a good reminder for the audience and for Americans that democracy continues. You know, elections are just like another day in the life of democracy. So excited to have this conversation. And why don't we start with just tell us what the States Project is?
Yeah, so the States Project is an organization that focuses exclusively on state legislatures and building power in state legislatures, building majorities for folks who are focused on improving people's lives. So we believe that state legislatures are the strongest force for change in this country, and that's why we work at that level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to unpack that, like, what, because I agree with it. I think I agree with the premise about there's this incredible locus of power in the states. But how did you come to that? How did you all come to that conclusion, and kind of what makes you so confident in that belief?
Well, our president and co-founder is Daniel Squadron, and he was a New York State senator for a very long time before co-founding the States Project. And that, I think, obviously is an important piece of this, that we are led by folks who came out of state legislatures. And my encounter with this was hearing Daniel Squadron speak at an event, and connecting the dots on state legislative power is something that I did from the outside. Our team was built among people who have done it from the inside. So we have regional political directors who have been the directors in their states of state caucuses. They're working to win state legislative power from their states. And we have team members who've been working on state policy for a long time, and team members who just have been focused here. But as someone who came from the outside of this, what happened for me was that I started to understand that during the first Trump presidency, everything that I cared about and everything that I was really worried about domestically was being decided in state capitals and not in Washington, D.C. And once I recognized that, I knew that it was a very powerful place to focus my energy and my activism. And that's exactly what I did. And one of the things that really guided me was connecting the dots on some policies that happened even before Trump was elected, which are things like the bathroom bill, which passed in my home state of North Carolina, and then passed in 20 some other states, and things like the standard ground gun laws, which passed in Tallahassee and then passed in 27 other states after letting Trayvon Martin's murderer go free in Florida. I started to realize, okay, that was Raleigh and Tallahassee who did that. And things like the Flint, Michigan water crisis, I started to think, okay, that's a Lansing problem, not a Washington, D.C. problem. And all of those things happened while President Obama was in office in D.C. And so I started to realize that, like, there are these 50 mini Congresses in our country, and they are where policies are passing, and they are where, American values are being reflected or not. And who's in power in state legislatures really determines how people live their lives in this country. So I think for a lot of our team, that has really been a central focus.
Yeah, and it's a good reminder too, like the way the Constitution was set up, it enumerated like a certain number of powers to the federal government, and then it left everything else to the states, and that was on purpose. And the idea, which I think is sort of the genius of the American system, is that you do create competition. You create legislative competition among the states for everything other than the things that were enumerated. And in that process, you arrive at maybe like a better answer. And I still believe that's valid, although there may be some ways that you could critique the premise now, just given where we are, as a country and where we are in terms of voter engagement, which I want to get into later. But before we do that, you mentioned too that sort of the two sort of underlying themes of the States Project are, one, we want to focus on states, and two, we want to focus on advancing legislatures that actually want to improve the lives of Americans. I don't know if I articulated exactly what you said, but does that mean it's a bipartisan effort? Is it strictly one party or the other? Like, what's that part of the story?
Yeah, we are officially a nonpartisan effort. So we want to work with majorities that are focused on improving people's lives. And so we have worked in states with various lawmakers. And, um, in Alaska, we've ended up supporting a bipartisan coalition that stands against a right wing governor. And so we really are focused on building majorities that are focused on improving people's lives.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up the Alaska because that was actually one of my questions. Because in previous episodes of the show, we had Nick Troiano from Unite America on, and we had Deb Otis from Fair Vote. And both of them have been involved in these election reform movements that, in the case of Alaska, produced this sort of open primaries with I believe ranked choice voting. Have you seen a material difference in the politics in Alaska as a result of those reforms?
I'll be honest and say I don't know. I'm not that deep into Alaska, so I feel like I don't have a good answer for that question.
Okay.
We do have people who work in Alaska, but I'm not one of them, so
Okay.
I'm not knee deep in that one.
Got it. Yeah, because like what Nick was saying when I interviewed him was that essentially Alaska was like every other state where the primary was like a weaponized tool of the political parties to make candidates toe the party line. And by opening it up, it created the conditions for a different majority to emerge. And the majority is one that sounds like, at least from what I've heard about it, it sounds like it's more aligned with the general premise of the States Project, which is like, hey, let's like focus on improving people's lives rather than getting into the fringes of the political parties and doing what they want us to do. So um, it seems like it's aligned, but I guess we'll have to table that question for somebody else.
Yeah, sorry about that. But you're
No.
absolutely right about, like the idea that there are these broad visions and values that a lot of Americans agree with. We have a whole policy arm that works around kind of a set of broad goals, values, things like investing in children, empowering people over special interests, clean air and water, things that really any human like nods their head at and says, yes, those are good things. And, under those broad values, we have sets of targets for states, things like ending hunger for 100% of households or ending mass incarceration in the state. And under those targets, our team has model bills that will move your state more towards achieving those goals. And they're good goals, they're popular goals um, in a nonpartisan way. And I think we even saw in this last election that people were really voting for a lot of shared values type stuff, even when they were voting for different political candidates, different political parties. We saw states that have Republican majorities voting for abortion access, and we saw states that have right wing majorities voting for paid leave and things like that. So there are really shared values among Americans, which is something that has given me a lot of hope in this time, which does feel incredibly divisive on a party level.
Yeah, it does. But I agree that the election, although presented by the mainstream media as sort of a one-sided landslide in favor, I don't actually think that that's true because I do think that Americans voted wildly differently across the country. And even though sort of a national consensus formed around President Trump, there's quite a bit of diversity um, in how that manifested and who got put in office and what issues people care about. And I think if they voted for anything, they voted for like, man, these political parties need to figure out a message that makes sense to the American people. And that's what they're looking for. Like they're searching, like, man, does anyone have a coherent vision that encapsulates all the things that I care about as a citizen? And I think the work still remains. I think both the Democrats and the Republicans have a lot of work to do to like come up with that coherent message. And I feel like the midterms are going to be super interesting because they're not done with this stuff. And that's just my high level view.
Yeah, I agree with you. And, I think that our team continues to think about it. And one of the things that I think brings us a lot of grounding in working with state legislative races is that it is always about what's local in these races. It is always about knocking on doors and talking to voters about the grass on the softball field, the cracks in the sidewalk, the traffic pattern downtown that makes everyone, head spin, and becoming a neighbor and, a friend is really helpful in state legislative campaigns and has left me feeling really good about a person-to-person interaction as opposed to what's happening online or what the news at the national level is, because the person-to-person connection is missing from national campaigns. And I think that's, of course, it's not scalable to knock on every door as a presidential campaigner, but in state legislative races, it's almost possible. So that's what our tactics kind of push people to do and incentivize people to do. And I think that is why we've, seen some success no matter what happens at the top of the ticket, because this is about that person-to-person connection.
Yeah. And it's a different level. It's more of a practical level of engagement. I feel like if there's a missing piece of the American political dialogue or political engagement, it's this local stuff. And everyone that I know that engages in local, I tend to find this, like, basically until you have children, you don't engage in local politics. And then once you have kids, you're like, hey, why are people like speeding through my neighborhood? And why is there, a homeless people, setting up an encampment on my street? And then you get really interested in it because your incentive or your focus has changed. But zooming out, there's a truth there, which is like whether or not the United States gives an extra $1 billion to fund the war in Ukraine is not really that important for the standard of living for the typical American family in Los Angeles or New York or anywhere. What matters more is, what's the neighborhood like? What kind of schools are there? What's the housing stock look like? What are the roads like? And these things are not, even though a lot of the money comes from the federal government, the policies are determined at a very different level than what's being covered in the news.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think it's a really important and maybe even somewhat hopeful point to make in this moment, which is that, state governments have incredible power and they are meant to be laboratories for democracy, right? They're meant to be healthcare going from Hawaii to Massachusetts to becoming the Affordable Care Act, or marriage equality going from state to federal. And they can be that when we elect majorities that are focused on improving people's lives. And state governments actually have incredible power and budget, honestly. One of the things that I know that President Trump has put out, saying he's going to defund the Department of Education, right? Which sounds scary to me, and I think sounds pretty threatening to folks. But state governments fund 92% of education in this country.
Yeah.
The federal government is 8%. So that's bad, but it's not existential for education in this country if you have a state government that is willing to fight for and fund public education. So I think when people start to look issue by issue at what they're worried about coming down from the federal government, they can understand that who's elected in their state can actually protect them from what's coming down in the federal government or advance federal policies that they think are going to help people in their state. And, we saw this under the Biden presidency. There were states that actively worked against Biden all the time, Texas, Florida, and they have a lot of power to do that. And I think we're going to see that dynamic again for the next 4 years.
Yeah, I think
with
so.
Different states.
Yeah, different states, exactly. Like the blue states are going to, like here in California, the various legislative bodies, like the state legislature and local, are sort of passing. I don't even know what they're passing, but they're passing like motions in favor of like protecting the immigrant population, which is so critical to these cities and to the labor force in these cities, and gearing up for what they did in the first Trump presidency to try to protect that population from deportation and other things like that. So that's just the beginning, but shows sort of the interplay. Again, it goes back to the point you made about the laboratories and the different layers of power in this country.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Like if folks are worried about RFK taking over the health department and thinking about that, it's like, okay, but states can insist that folks get vaccinated in schools, and states can insist that there's fluoride in the water, and states have their own places to assert themselves. And it's actually like way more powerful than people might know, especially because most people have no idea who goes to their state capital for them. I don't want to call out your listeners, but if folks don't know, it's really, really important. And it's something that I will admit I did not know until 2016, when I suddenly took a look around and realized that I hadn't looked below Washington, D.C. ever, really.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's some hope there.
I think that's true of a lot of Americans. One of the topics I wanted to cover with you is sort of the civic apathy question, and around these local and state elections, and it gets worse and worse. Like the closer you go, it's sort of paradoxical, right? The closer you go to like practical levels where you could actually make a difference in your life, in your daily life, the less people vote. And so like people in LA, LA is like 4 million, and you could win the mayor with like 500,000 votes or something like that, which is wild. Is that also true in New York City?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So it doesn't take much. And then if you look at the underlying state legislature elections, the turnout's even worse. A lot of people have not even the slightest clue who the representatives are. And when you look at data like that, like how do you interpret that? What does that make you think about America? Like, is it something we need to fix? Is it working? Like, is it the fact that educated voters who are voting, they know enough, and so we're okay? Is it a bigger deal? What do you think?
No, I mean, I think, the goal for a democracy is to get as many people as possible engaged, and voting all the way down the ticket, of course, not doing the down ballot drop off thing. And, I think that there is something missing when we have this much of the population choosing to vote, or choosing to only vote at the top of the ticket. And to be honest, there is a very bright spotlight that is trained on Washington, D.C. And, most people just have no idea what's going on locally. And I would say decimation of local media certainly hasn't helped. The centralization of national media that only focuses on the White House and Congress and the Supreme Court. There are state Supreme Courts too, and state capitals, obviously. And so I think that there's a lot in the landscape that has led to this. But when we see something like in 2023, Congress passed about 35 bills, right? But Michigan had a new Democratic trifecta. And so the state Senate, the state House, and the governor's mansion were all controlled by Democrats. And they passed 321 bills, including codifying the right to abortion in the state, ending right to work so unions can organize again, a climate bill that was really one of the strongest in the country, free breakfast and lunch for school children. Like, this is where the rubber meets the road on that daily life policy that you're talking about. And folks really feel that. And I think a big goal is to make sure that when folks feel it, they also know why it happened. Because one of the things that happened in terms of our national politics is that from 2010 to 2016, the right wing organized very heavily, and were able to flip close to 1,000 state legislative seats from blue to red. And in those states where they won majorities in state houses and state senates, they made people's lives bad. They defunded education, put in right to work laws, and gutted environmental protections. But people didn't say, oh, that must be my state senator, my state house rep, let me go talk to them. They blamed what they could see and what the media always covers, which was President Obama, and hit a button for change in 2016 because their life wasn't that good and things had gotten worse. And making that connection for people of like, where's this policy coming from? Why did we go down to 4 days of school in Oklahoma, for example? Why is education defunded that badly? It's not coming from Washington, D.C. You know, making those connections for people, I think, is incredibly important. And one of the States Project really believes that state lawmakers are the people who are on the front lines of all of this stuff. And really elevating them and helping them share their values and what they want to do for their voters and their, and their states is a really important piece of this, like public engagement piece. And so one of the tactics that we use when we work with state legislatures is something called the Local Press Project, which is during a campaign year, having the in-state folks hire press consultants to get local press for the candidates who are running in these kind of tipping point seats that we invest in. And that means everything from a small town newspaper to a local radio show to a morning show. But every bit of that is incredibly important to help people connect what's happening in their lives to where the power is coming from to make that change. And so for me, it feels like something that we're working on, but yeah, we're not there yet. Most people still aren't looking at state capitals.
Yeah. I feel like there's a need, a huge need for some kind of, like, maybe it's an opportunity for like a tech company or something to think about how you get all this information about what state legislators are like advancing to the floor, what they're voting on, and put it together in some coherent fashion so that if you were like wanted to like be an active citizen and say, hey, what is my state senator up to? You could type in your address and boom, it come up, and then you'd find all kinds of information about here's what they believe in, here's what they voted for last time, here's what they said on their campaign speech. I feel like there's some opportunity to create that, and maybe it exists. It probably exists in some capacity, but it's not super popular. It's not as easy as going to Politico.com or New York Times, or pick whatever one you care about the most. But so I really like the idea of supporting the local press, because I do believe there's like a huge scarcity of real information. And even if you go, like what I found is, even if you go to like the candidate's website, let's say you go to your state rep's website or something, you can't really know that person from that. You don't really know what they've voted for. It requires like actually quite a bit of homework.
It
Yeah.
does.
Yeah.
And it's, it's all public information, right? Their votes are all public, but looking on an old state legislature website that like is confusing and in a chart that makes no sense is not a user-friendly way to
Yeah.
get that information. And I would say there's some nefarious stuff that happens in state legislatures, like in North Carolina, we just helped break a supermajority there, breaking a right-wing supermajority in the state house so that the new governor, Josh Stein, who is a Democrat, will have veto power in the state. So an incredibly important power threshold. We broke it, and the supermajority is gone. But those folks aren't being seated until January. So in the meantime, what the right-wing legislators are doing is they have a bill moving that is called a hurricane relief bill. But embedded in that bill is a power grab to strip the governor of more powers ahead of seating this new legislature where the supermajority is broken. So on a public record later on, something that's called a hurricane relief bill might have a lot of votes against it because what's actually inside it is all of this power grab stuff. So it's kind of an interesting thing that it's playing politics, and it really does require a robust local press that is focused on state capitals. And actually, luckily, North Carolina has a pretty good one, even in an independent local press called The Assembly that focuses on Raleigh. There's one in New York called New York Focus. But these are kind of independent news sources that have popped up because of what you talked about, the opportunity to do it, because suddenly we were just covering national politics and all watching CNN and MSNBC and Fox, and they were not drilling down on what was happening state by state.
Yeah, totally. I've noticed something in my state where the NIMBY movement, which I don't agree with, by and large, there are moments and times maybe when they've made the right call, but the NIMBY movement is sort of a big negative for most of the country. But they've sort of showed the truth, or they've paved the way if you want to create change in this country by recognizing a fundamental truth, which is that the citizen is the customer of the government, and the legislature is sort of like listening to customer feedback. And unfortunately, the only people that are speaking tend to be these, what I believe is not really even a majority position in California. Like the NIMBYs are a minority, but they win in politics because they are the loudest voice, the most annoying voice. They send the most emails. They show up at the public forums and whatnot. And the reason I know it's not a majority is that this really weird dynamic has happened where at the local level, city councils are incredibly supportive of NIMBY causes. Even though on paper they all support affordable housing, they always cave. But those same districts are sending people to Sacramento who are passing like pro housing bills every day. Like every session, there's like 100 pro housing bills. So there's some kind of majority that's formed that is clearly anti-NIMBY. And then there's another minority or some other coalition that's formed that's caused the NIMBYs to be able to win in local elections, which is super interesting. I don't know if you're seeing that across the country as well.
That is really interesting. And it's definitely like a city-state dynamic that we see play out in New York as well. Yeah.
Okay. So the New York State Legislature is passing pro-housing laws all the time.
They are, yeah. I mean, there's definitely there, and honestly, the city has been too. There's also a mayor-city council conflict that happens.
Yep.
So yeah, absolutely. There's all these levels of government kind of balancing, but you're absolutely right that there are vocal advocates who do get a lot of attention.
Yeah. Fascinating. Well, let's talk about money for a second. Are you all operating in every state?
So electorally, we operate in states where governing power is on the line, where we think we can be a difference maker. So um, we are not in every state. We have a set of target states each year. And so we actually do a 99 state chamber analysis every year. It's 99 because Nebraska is unicameral. They just have a state senate. And so we figure out where a power threshold may need defending or challenging. And that can be flipping a state. It can also be breaking a supermajority or defending against one. Or building one, as we were attempting to do in Nevada this past cycle against a governor who vetoes everything, a right-wing governor who vetoed everything. So a lot of different power thresholds that we look at, but we are only electorally in states where governing power is on the line to some extent. And then our policy work extends throughout the country. So our policy team works in states that we're not in electorally, for example.
That makes sense. And I have to imagine that the amount of money that is required to do political work successfully in these races is way less than Congress, right?
Way less. So one of my favorite sentences, it is often cheaper to change the balance of power in an entire state chamber than it is to win a single competitive congressional seat. Congressional races cost millions and millions of dollars, and state legislative races do not.
Yeah, I feel like I don't remember. I think it's in New York. There was one race that was like over 20 million for Congress just in the past cycle, maybe even 40 million. It was a really like shocking number actually for that.
It's wild. And we watched the spotlit Senate races raise close to 100 million. We watched I remember, and actually this broke me a little bit. I don't think we have the numbers yet from 2024, but in 2020 we watched Amy McGrath run against Mitch McConnell, and Jamie Harrison running against Lindsey Graham in South Carolina, and in Maine, the efforts to challenge Susan Collins. Like those races just raised tens of millions of dollars, to the point where Sarah Gideon, who was challenging Susan Collins, ended up with over $10 million left in her campaign funds after the election, because more money came in than she could spend. And that's the type of money that could flip a couple states. So yeah, we that honestly was one of the first reasons I got involved. It's a non-romantic reason, but a very practical one. I didn't feel like I was a person who could hand giant checks to politicians.
Yeah.
I did feel like I could organize a meaningful amount of dollars from my friends, my families, and my networks to target a state legislature because it takes a lot less. And in my view now, like it can have a lot more impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And what is the differential? Like, let's say Congress was X, what does a state legislature seat go for, in terms of how much you have to raise?
Yeah, so I've got this stat. Let me just make
Not to
sure I'm
put you
getting
on
it
the
right.
spot on numbers, but I'm curious.
No, no. Um, we had this stat up on our website for a while about this, but it's essentially that state legislative races, on average, I believe, cost about 6% of a congressional race and about 3% of or 6% of a U.S. House race and about 3% of a U.S. Senate race.
Okay.
So it's very different state to state. Like there are states where the average race will cost $20,000, and there are states where it's more like $1 million because there aren't as tight campaign finance laws. It does rely on that a bit, but on average, it is an incredible bang for the buck in terms of um, investing in campaigns.
Yeah. That's a crazy number. 3 and 6%. Here in West Hollywood in Los Angeles, like even West Hollywood, which is like 2 square miles or something like that. It's a really tiny place. There's 40,000 residents. You need to raise like several hundred thousand to win city council here, which is kind of crazy. And to win city
Wow.
council in Los Angeles, you're talking millions. The mayor of LA is probably like last time it was wild because Rick Caruso, who's a prominent business leader, ran. He spent like over 100 million, but typically that was like a $10 million race, but probably going to be a lot more going forward. And so it really makes you like wonder, like, man, where is all this money going to come from, and how do you organize it? How do you organize people to support candidates in these places? And given everything else, like I feel like part of the problem, to go back to the civic engagement problem, part of the problem is that there's too many people with their hands out, right? Like you gotta donate to the presidential campaign, the Senate, House, your local. And so I really feel for these local politicians because they're the last person on earth that anyone wants to hear from. You get the phone call like, "Hey, will you give me $1,000 for my campaign?" They've already gotten so many robocalls and texts from the political parties. It must be a really like daunting challenge for these folks.
Absolutely. And the thing is, like, even if they're your representatives, you may never have heard their names. These are not folks who are on MSNBC at night or even in the newspaper during the day. Like this is a level of government that operates in darkness for a lot of people. And we used to have a sign in our office that said, "Not where the glamour is, just where the power is." And I really do believe that lack of spotlight is a challenge for folks. I mean, it's one of the reasons why our Giving Circles program, which is the program that I work on at the States Project, is such a boost for the folks in these races because I say to Giving Circle leaders, you will not know these folks' names. They're not going to be people who are politically famous yet. It is a big bench builder. But they are the people who are deciding on the issues that you care about. So when people talk about where do they want to invest, what I think about is these are the people who are deciding education funding, environmental policy, healthcare, civil rights, abortion, voting rights. If there are issues that you care about, changing majorities in state capitals changes all of those issues. It hits all of the things that you would like to have shift in this country or have made better in this country. And when we're able to work on things at that level, it feels so foundational to me. So when Giving Circle leaders start talking about this, they talk less about, hey, here are the candidates, because the candidates are people who you won't have heard of. But to be able to say to people, hey, listen, once we are able to shift majorities, we're going to be able to get free breakfast and lunch for school children in the state. we are going to be able to codify the right to abortion. We are going to be able to expand voting in the state. We are going to be able to do all of these things by winning a specific set of tipping point seats and shifting power. That, to me, I think brings people into the bigger story of not only state legislatures, but also the values that we share, sometimes even across parties, about what we want for people in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. How much are you all like raising per year? What are your statistics around that?
Yeah, so our total raise this for 2024, for the cycle 2023-2024, was around $70 million. And that is big, and that includes our electoral work and our policy work. So that includes PAC dollars, C3 and C4, all in around $70 million, which sounds like a very big number. It's like a little less than Beto raised when he ran for governor of Texas. So it's not a huge number in the scheme of politics, but it is an incredible number in terms of focusing on state legislatures. It is, as far as we know, the largest outside investment in state legislatures in American history. And it's something that we're really proud of. You know, the DNC in 2024 invested about $2.5 million in state legislatures. It just hasn't been a focus for the national party, except on the right, because the right has been building power in state legislatures for decades, really since Goldwater. And that has been something that I think we have hoped would shift over time, that we still hope will shift, that there will be more resources sent into state capitals, because this really is like where the rubber meets the road on policy and Americans live their lives.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so if the DNC is at 2.5, what is the RNC at? Like, are they materially
You
higher?
know, I don't have that number, but I will
Okay.
say that they definitely they invest heavily in state legislatures, and they also have kind of a network of um, billionaire donors who really see a return on investment for investing in state legislatures, right? I know that in 2022, the States Project was the largest investor on the hard side with candidates and campaigns in Michigan, and the largest investor on the Republican side was the DeVos family, right? Because they have a financial incentive to defunding education and getting the privatized movement going forward. And there's a lot of those folks in each state who can invest heavily as individuals. And so one of the things that I love about the giving circles is we're bringing in people giving at all levels. You know, I think we're up to around 40,000 people who've contributed to giving circles across the country. And that really brings a lot of people into this fight and this focus. And it brings a lot of small dollars to the fight, which is awareness building, which is reaching out to friends and families and neighbors, and hopefully changing the conversation so that people aren't just talking about, well, I guess in 4 more years, we'll get activated again. No, there are no off years in tending to democracy and trying to keep it going, because that is the fight we are in. And when you work at the state legislative level, you can see that year after year after year. You know, there are states that have elections coming up this November in 2025, including Virginia, where we need to protect slim 1-seat majorities in the state Senate and the state House. So there are opportunities every year. There are places to look every year. And it's a really strategic way to get involved in politics in this country, because I think a lot of people feel a little burned by political involvement and investment. And for me, this has continued to be a very hopeful and very therapeutic place to focus.
And what's the vision for the future? Like, is there just raise more money, try to get to 100 million? Like, what's the state's project's grand plan?
So in terms of electoral, we always do an analysis of, you know, our tactics and how they worked, and, you know, what we want to do, how we want to improve them. You know, our goal really is to make sure that the states that we're working in are not just building great campaigns for the cycle that we're in, but also building an infrastructure of knowledge and research and best practices that moves them forward into, hopefully infinity. That's a really important thing. We bring in kind of key tactics when we go into a state. And I mentioned door knocking, which is one of them. We incentivize candidate door knocking with a door knocking challenge because there's no silver bullet in these races. But if there were, it would be the candidates personally knocking on doors. So we measure the candidates' personal door knocking numbers. And the top 4 door knockers each month get additional campaign contributions from us, which really incentivizes that best practice. We also want to make sure that the ads that they're running get ad tested locally. So doing focus group ad testing on ads before the media buys go out is a really important piece of our program as well. And the other one's the local press project, which I mentioned, which is getting those local press mentions. When we get our local in-state partners on board with those tactics, something that they carry through year after year, and we can measure and hone and keep improving on year after year. So certainly we're always kind of looking at our tactics and be like, is this the right suite? Is this our core electoral program? Or is there something else we need to add in or think about? So definitely be doing that. And then of course, the policy team is there to work to help states align on a vision for their state of what they want to do and how they're going to improve people's lives going forward, which becomes a nice message to voters of this is what we've been able to do for you. And that makes them easier to elect the next time. It's kind of a virtuous cycle, if you will. So our goal is going to be electoral and policy, electoral and policy, electoral and policy, until we get to the point where we're working in more states, certainly. And that is going to take, to be honest, fairer maps in a lot of these states. A lot of these states are incredibly gerrymandered. In 70% of the country, that's the state legislature doing that gerrymandering. And it's really important that we get fair maps. This year we were in Wisconsin. They had fair maps for the first time in a very long time. And we were able to flip 14 seats, 4 seats in the state Senate, 10 seats in the state assembly. And that is a wild amount of seats in a year when the Harris campaign lost at the top of the ticket in Wisconsin. And still, all of those seats shifted. And so we can see a path to a trifecta in Wisconsin in the coming cycle. And that's exciting and will change everything about the daily lives of folks in Wisconsin and become another one of those laboratories for democracy that we're looking for. So there's a lot of plans. There's a lot of execution that has to happen. But this year we will be focusing on analyzing what happened, which of our tactics we need to bring back into the fold, and what moves the needle the most.
Yeah. I really love the vision. I feel like you guys are onto something. And I think that this effort to engage people in more local politics is really, really important to the health of our democracy. I think that I get the feeling from talking to people that Americans are looking for ways to express a civic responsibility or civic virtue. And they just don't know, they don't feel empowered to do it. But when they, when for those who do it, it's always positive. They feel closer to their community. They feel closer to the neighbors. Even when they disagree, they see the integrity of the process rather than just some black box and hyperbolistic media coverage. It's the real work of democracy being done. And so I wish you guys the best, and I hope you guys continue to expand and do this work across the country. It's exciting.
Well, thank you. It has given me a lot of hope and a lot of focus over the past 8 years. So
yeah, I'm curious. You are also a published author. You've written several books, published several books in the young adult world. How did you go from? Well, you didn't really stop writing, but how did you get interested in this project in the first place?
Yeah. Well, I went to a publishing holiday party in December of 2016. And in that moment, I was reeling from Trump's first election and feeling like I didn't know didn't know what to do or how to get involved, but I felt the need to get involved. I felt like there was a fire burning next to me and I needed to pick up a hose. And I, at that publishing holiday party, heard Daniel Squadron, who was then a New York State Senator, speak. And he really turned my world around because I started to understand the things that I was worried about happening in state capitals. And he really gave me a place to focus. I started a giving circle with some other young adult authors. We became the first giving circle for the States Project when later that year, Daniel resigned from the New York State Senate to start the States Project with some co-founders. And it was just go time from there. What happened was we went into Virginia in 2017. We focused on 10 seats, filled the final campaign gaps for those 10 with our giving circle raise, and 9 of those candidates won. And the balance of power got so close in Richmond that the next year Virginia expanded Medicaid and 400,000 people got health care who hadn't had it before. We felt so connected to that policy outcome that we wanted to go do it again. And so I went to talk to Daniel Squadron about, I want to meet all the other people who heard you speak and did giving circles. And he was like, someone else really did it. And I was like, oh no, this is the most powerful thing I've ever done. This is the most impactful I've ever felt. And so I started the Giving Circles program at the States Project to help other people be able to plug in the same way that I did and feel the same way that I did about working at this foundational level of democracy. So that's how it all started. That's how it continues. My Giving Circle is starting year 9 this January, which I can't believe, but we have been steadily tending to democracy, focusing on state legislative races, no matter what's going on at the top of the ticket. And I will tell you, it has been the most rewarding and grounding work I've ever done. I really miss writing young adult novels. Writing is always there, and I'll go back to it one day.
Okay, so as of right now, you're not writing the novels. You're doing this full time.
I'm not. I do this full time now. Yep.
Got it. When is the last one that you published?
My last one came out in 2018 because I really stopped writing around 2017 to do this work. And
After you
so
had
2018.
After you had the big win in Richmond, you stopped. That's so interesting. Well, maybe you'll have to write a book about American democracy. That could be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, life is good for writing, and I know that these experiences are going to come back with me to the page. So we'll see what comes out.
Yeah, it's like information and stories that you can craft, but that's a cool story because you felt called to do something, and then you went to this party. Like, I feel like life. I really believe in sort of the magic side of life. Life presents opportunities to you if you pay attention to them, and it was an immediate success. Like, not immediate, obviously it took some time, but your first effort at being a civic activist produced like incredible result for you, for your values and what you believed in. That's a very cool story.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, Melissa, thank you so much for taking time to share about your story and the States Project and all the cool work you're doing for America. I appreciate you taking the time and appreciate the work that you do. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Nick. It was a delight to be here.